Coastal defense. That means defense of a coastline of 4,750 miles. How is it achieved? We talk of the white cliffs of Albion, but not all of it is like that. Some of it consists of sand dunes, undulating expanses running down to the water's edge. There are estuaries stretching far inland, and there are seaside resorts, towns with promenades and piers. All of them must have their own form of defense. All of them have to be protected from the air. Britain is now ringed with anti-aircraft guns which crack into action at the first sign of aerial attack in force. As an invasion by water would probably be accompanied by intensified air assault, the anti-aircraft system with its searchlights and batteries and highly complex instruments is an important part of coastal defense. So are the fighter squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires, who from the air have opposed such attacks with glorious success. Ever memorable will be the battles over Dover, where armadas of enemy bombers and fighters have been routed when they have attacked our shipping, destroyers, and balloons. The first job of coastal defense is against enemy attack at surface level. Many German attacks against our shores never reach them, thanks to the aircraft of the Coastal Command. Aerial vigilance is one of the means by which hostile operations by sea are frustrated. Flying boats perform this job, and very nobly they do it. The short Sunderland, a huge ship of the air, is a terror to any rash attacker. Its heavy protection and gunpowder has sent many a bomber crashing down in flames. The U-boat has been the chief victim of the Coastal Command aircraft, and when the tale is eventually told, many wrecked submarines will have owed their doom to the vigilance of these airmen. The Coastal Command works in cooperation with the Navy, and with the Navy's least spectacular ships, trawlers, minesweepers, and those maids-of-all-work, the destroyers. It is the destroyers and aircraft which have the job of escorting the merchant vessels bringing Britain supplies. The Germans have tried hard to beat the convoy system, but they have failed. As in the last war, so in this, the convoy system has proved its efficiency. Undisturbed by bombs and shells, the long lines of ships pass up the channel to our ports. The truth is that it's not easy to hit a ship on the move, able to alter course while the bomb is still falling. Our coastal defenders have also to deal with German mines. The floating magnetic mine did some damage at first, but within a few days the Navy had found the answer to it. But there are still German mines to clear from the sea, and the job of the minesweeper is one of the hardest and most dangerous in war. Men of the minesweeping fleets take their lives in their hands whenever they put to sea. The principle of minesweeping is to take a wide sweep with wires some feet below the surface, and by cutting the mine adrift from its moorings, bring it to the surface. When the mine is floating, the crew explode it by rifle fire. Back in port, they paint chevrons on the funnels to denote the number of mines exploded by each vessel. Each chevron represents so many mines. I'm not allowed to tell you how many, but I can assure you that it works out at many more times than one. Mines are a menace when laid by the enemy, but we lay our mines to protect our shipping channels. Any enemy ships making for our shores must first penetrate these minefields. The mines are laid by ships specially built or adapted for mine laying. Hundreds of them can be dropped in a short time. Britain has always published the positions of her minefields round her coast. The mines are anchored, and should they break loose, a special mechanism renders them ineffective. A similar idea in the way of defense is the boom. This is a long, strong net laid at the entrance to important harbors and estuaries, and its chief use is to prevent submarines entering the ports. But it is obviously some defense also against any ship with a considerable draft. These are the ships which lay the booms. So much for the Navy's part in coastal defense. What about the armies? Today we have a larger army than ever before to defend us against invasion. Along the low-lying sand dunes, battalions of men who have had experience in France are waiting, equipped and ready. The big guns are in position. Strands of barbed wire represent but a small part of the defenses which we have built. And all along the cliffs and high ground, observers are watching and waiting, among them the experienced men of the Coast Guard Service. The Home Guard, with its special mission for dealing with parachutists, patrols day and night ready to go into action to picket any enemy while the message goes to the regular troops to come and clean up the invaders. And we know that the Army now has highly mobile units trained to surround and exterminate enemy parties. The way of the invader through our various lines of coastal defense will not be easy. When he has accounted for the Navy's mines, guns, and torpedoes, and avoided the RAF's flying boats and fighters, he must still land in the face of the Army's artillery. And he must still land in the face of the united armies of democracy.
Hi guys, and welcome back to a new video. So this is a very different kind. It's sort of similar to the video I done a couple of years ago, really, on 231 Brigade, but this is a bit more in depth, I would say. Try to be anyway. So a talk I did, April last year at the Living History UK Festival was basically based on the Operation Sealion, the planned invasion of Britain, and its sort of shortcomings. Well, I say shortcomings, that's a bit of an understatement. It's massive unravelling if it never occurred. That's basically going to be the theme of this video. I've seen multiple claims that, it would have worked and all this sort of stuff, but there are so many factors to prove that theory wrong that it would have worked. It's ridiculous and laughable, in my personal view. I've seen multiple videos. I saw a video. It was a podcast episode from, I think, the World War II history podcast. The podcast itself is fine, absolutely fine. However, the gentleman who's been interviewed was basically, in my personal view, just peddling his book for gullible people to read and believe every word he says. Very few of what he says in the podcast when he's been interviewed and what I'm guessing what's in his book, I haven't bothered to read it because I'm not giving that guy money, considering what he had blasted out on this episode of the podcast. I can't even be bothered to remember. I think it was called roughly about Eagle something or whatever it was. I don't care to remember his name just because I don't feel he needs the publicity. Publicity is the word I was looking for. Because I feel quite strongly about this. So the whole picture and the perceived atmosphere in 1940, with the evacuation of the BEF from Dunkirk, is Britain was disarmed and was vulnerable to an all-powerful German juggernaut. I will put some links to some great videos and some great content actually below the description, in the description of this video, that you can go check out. And also what sort of prompted this sort of video as well. I was going to plan to do it before anyway, but this sort of sped up, was a video I came across yesterday. I just actually finished watching today because I was a bit apprehensive about watching it. But I just finished watching today. And surprisingly not too bad. By History Hit. Well, it was on Timeline. But it's by the guys from History Hit with Dan Snow, etc. And also I can't remember his name now. But he was in Betweeners. He was on it as well, which is really, really bizarre. He actually knows quite a bit. I'm quite surprised. It was actually quite good. It was interesting. And what they lined out is what I originally thought. And there's another video by Historiograph, which I probably think is one of the best videos I've seen on Operation Sealion. So I will put that in the description below, along with some other bits here and now. Getting back to it. So the perceived feeling at the time was Britain was basically at the mercy of an all-powerful German juggernaut or force or whatever you want to call it. And it was only a matter of time before the Germans would invade. And this is true on the sense of the feeling at the time. People thought we were vulnerable. However, the reality is wildly different. Like, people saying, if the RAF had fallen, then we just like, no. Like, people say, the Luftwaffe would just have to destroy the RAF. Like, there's this. They keep using the thing like destroying the RAF, and you got to understand, like, this is only fighter command that is being taken on by the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain in a broader sense. Like, obviously, other branches are involved as well, but the vast majority of ones who are doing the fighting in the Battle of Britain are fighter command. And it would have been fighter command been pushed back, really, and been Mersey battle. Vast majority of bomber command, coastal command, etc. would still be fairly operational and would be mostly intact. Or almost completely intact, really. And this whole thing, they was push back the RAF. So, well, the RAF would have pulled back to beyond London. If the bombing campaign on the German airfield had ramped up, we would have pulled our aircraft. Most of the thing would be the fighter command would have been pulled back beyond London to basically join up with 12 Group, which was out of range of German fighters. and it's the fighters that are the ones taking out the aircraft majority of the time. The bombers bombing airfields, they bomb facilities if they could accurately, but also once they've got no fighter support, the bombers are completely vulnerable, as shown in the attacks on Scotland from German airfields in Norway. German bombers were completely vulnerable because they had no support whatsoever from any German fighter. And that's just on that side of things. There's a whole thing to it, like, if the RAF fell, then this... No. Like, there's something called the Royal Navy. And then I've had this before where I might bring up the Royal Navy and go, oh, what about the Luftwaffe? What about the Luftwaffe? Or they would just easily just knock out the Royal Navy. Yeah, the average fighter pilot or the average dive bomber pilot wasn't training to take out a moving destroyer which was going at 30 knots and can move on a very easily to avoid your attack. Like, yes, Luftwaffe aircraft had taken out British shipping, the vast majority of which was slow-moving transport or container ships, moving at maybe 15 knots, and didn't really have much to avoid. Couldn't really avoid much. Unlike the Royal Navy, which could muster multiple ships, which could defend themselves against the aircraft, could move against people. So, oh, what about Dunkirk? Well, they were slow-moving, picking up troops offshore. They were docked. Most of the ships knocked out were stationary, which is what the Luftwaffe dive bomber force was used to attacking, either stationary targets or slow-moving troop convoys on a road. Like, this wasn't a destroyer they were targeting. Like, it's very, very different. And even that, say, like, it's one thing attacking, like, being able to knock out a destroyer, another thing knocking out a capital ship. And then I had the arguments brought up to me, oh, what about Force H and the Japanese? Well, there were two battleships, one battleship, one battle cruiser, far away from home, out of range of most of air cover, and a little bit, but not much, with no destroyer support, on their own, being attacked by aircraft and aircrew who were used and trained to attack ships. Like, it's a very different... Like, the Japanese were very apt and developed and trained in attacking... Like, these were pilots who had seen service through the war in China and had a lot of experience. Unlike the Luftwaffe, who put very little, under Goering that is, to anti-shipping operations prior to the war. It was very much an air supremacy force and a tactical bomber force, tactical bomber force for taking out land targets, not necessarily shipping. Majority of the ship losses for the Royal Navy to aircraft were more so in the Mediterranean, where they were tightly packed and attacked by multiple aircraft of German and Italian, and that was later on in the war. That's 41-42. The majority of that is happening, and majority of British naval ships that have been sunk up to this point were either by submarines or surface action. So it's and most of the time, either they were slow moving or they were in port, like the Royal Oak at the beginning of the war, somewhere a submarine. Excuse me. It's basically the only reasonable people in the German High Command at this time were the Kriegsmarine. They knew how outgunned they were completely by the Royal Navy, especially after the Norway campaign. Like, the Germans lost 2 cruisers, a light and a heavy cruiser, through the whole of the Norway campaign. One of their brand new heavy cruisers, the Blucher, was sunk by coastal gunfire and coastal torpedo launches whilst trying to sail up towards Oslo. They also lost 10 destroyers, almost half of their entire destroyer fleet, as well as another light cruiser, and multiple other ships damaged, like heavily damaged. Like, as I said, they lost a heavy cruiser. They also had a heavy cruiser heavily damaged. They did have 2 battleships, the Scharnhorst and Gnadenhau, but their sort of use in a Sealion operation was okay at best, just because they're quite big, and they were like anchored way up north, and bringing them down to the Channel was always very risky until the Channel Dash. That was one thing, but trying to muster them for an invasion was quite bloody obvious. So the majority of the invasion force would be made up of German destroyers and other armed craft, as well as the cruisers they had left, which was like 2. It wasn't many at all. Bear in mind, between Harwich and Sheerness, which is basically the mouth of the Thames estuary, the Royal Navy had 30. Just in there alone. That's 30 of 87 around the UK and other duties. Around the British Isles, I should say. And it's crazy to think. Along with that, you have the Home Fleet, which is up in Scapa Flow, which has 11 capital ships, like battleships and aircraft carriers, etc. As well as, like, around the UK, you have 700 armed patrol craft. So this is anything from patrol boats, PT boats, etc. Basically the same thing. And other armed patrol craft. 35 submarines. Very effective. Like, one of the cruisers sunk during the Norway campaign was sunk by a British submarine, the Truant. It's like so many, like, ridiculous, and then you add in the minesweepers as well, because that was an important part of the German plan for invasion, with the later plan anyway. We'll get into that in a bit. Was to lay belts of mines on either side of the invasion force to protect it. The British could throw 165 minesweepers at these things. Like, it was like they were around the British Isles, and this was just what was stationed around the United Kingdom, let alone round stationed in Canada or in the Mediterranean or in the Pacific. Bear in mind, the Japanese hadn't joined the war yet, so the British had plenty of ships to throw at this. Like, people go, oh well, the British had a hell of a time chasing down the Bismarck. Yeah, but that was in the open sea, and they didn't know where it was. We know where an invasion would happen, and once it started, we know exactly where to go. It's a very strange. The sort of arguments put forward are always very hollow. They're very easy to poke holes in. It's almost like a Japanese window. It's made of paper. It looks nice and all, but if you put your hand through it, if you put your hand gently on it, it's going to go through. Well, put any force into it. I mean, it's just going to go straight through. It's a very thin paper argument, and that's just the Royal Navy. And like the Royal Navy had shown the British had shown they want to fight on. Like, they had seen the threat after the fall of France that the French Navy could fall into the hands of the Germans. There's a lot of things around this, basically. There's a bit of controversy in that, with what happened at Mers el-Kabir in Oran, not Iran, but Oran, in North Africa. In regards to when the British fleet, I think it was Force H, I think they were Force H as well, I can't remember exactly, fired on the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir, with the loss of almost 2,000 French sailors. It's a shame, but at the same time, we were put in a position where it was what we had to do. And the French admiral who was at Mers el-Kabir, personally, is who I personally blame for the whole situation getting out of hand, and could have resolved the situation very easily, but his arrogance and his stubbornness led to the disaster, I personally think. It was the British who fired at the end of the day, but it was the fault of the French admiral. I'll add a video into that actually as well, from Dracanafel, down below in the description. Probably a really, really good video actually on it. Sorry, I'm going a little bit of tangent here, but the overwhelming supremacy of British naval power was nothing the Germans could ever tout to. Like, the Germans had a plan prior to the war called Plan Z, which was to build up its naval forces, but it never even really got into action. The only real out things for that were the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, which weren't completed until 1941. Which is kind of what the Kriegsmarine was hoping for to postpone a possible invasion of Britain, if they had to go through with it, until 1941, when they had these new ships in production to replace what they've lost, and also give them time to get more destroyers out. And bear in mind, like, people say, oh, well, the Germans had this. So, well, not until this part of the war. And anyway, after Sealion was postponed indefinitely, that's when the Germans decided to ramp up their U-boat production to use in the Battle of the Atlantic, which was way more of a threat to making Britain surrender or come to the negotiating table in the first place, or just generally just knock us out of the war, than an invasion of England. It was much more likely to work than an invasion of England. It was working quite well during the First World War. But yeah, that's one of those things. So let's look at, say, the players in this. To call the phrase or whatever. You have Franz Halder, who's a commander of OKH, who basically is the overall commander of the German army, who put forward some ideas to Hitler after Hitler had issued Directive 16, which was his directive to organise a plan for the invasion of England. Franz Halder put forward a plan of landing 13 divisions on a massive front between Ramsgate, which is basically just beyond Dover, to the east, all the way to Lyme Regis, all the way, which is ridiculous. Like, bear in mind that includes Portsmouth, which is like the naval base on the south coast, which is very heavily defended in itself, with multiple forts around its hills. You're landing 13 divisions in the first wave, going up to 39 divisions within the first week or so, or however long it may take. Bear in mind, D-Day landing forces in regards to the seaborne troops were 5 divisions, and then another 3 divisions of airborne. They were planning to land 13 in the first wave. Like, the amount of shipping involved in it. Yes, German divisions at this time were a lot smaller than the Allied divisions later on in the war, but even so, that is a ridiculous amount of men. That was later revised to basically be landing 67,000 men, so around about 9 divisions between Folkestone and Selsey Bill, which is a very much smaller front. But even so, 9 divisions, 67,000 men. Bear in mind, the landing force in Normandy again was about 150,000. That was 1944 with massive preparation, like of over a year of preparation, with purpose-built craft, air supremacy, and not just air superiority in every sense of the word. Like, the German Air Force was completely inept. Like, it was negligible. Like, the RAF would not be, even if they were pushed back, the RAF would not be negligible. Adding Coastal Command, adding Bomber Command, and a lot of the RAF would work, especially with Bomber Command, would work at night, and be very devastating to any landing force. So that's that. One thing that did really piss off the Kriegsmarine was a comment made by Alfred Jodl, who was commander of OKW, which was Oberstkommand West, basically, commander of the German forces in the West, so France, etc. He described an invasion of England, or Britain, the UK, whatever you want to say, the Great Britain, as a river crossing on a broad front. Now, this incensed the Kriegsmarine to a ridiculous end, because, as some other historians have pointed out, like, the Channel is, like, well, a river is not susceptible to storms, high waves, just ridiculous different kinds of weather in general, with all that sort of included. And it was not patrolled by the enemy high seas fleet. That's a quote from Stephen Bungay, basically. Bit paraphrased, but still. Very good historian. And it's ridiculous. Like, bear in mind, the invasion date was eventually planned for mid-September, when autumn storms are rocking the Channel. And the bulk of the German fighting force that would be landing would be transported across the Channel in river barges, converted river barges. So basically they've got a river barge, they've cut a big hole in the front and make it like a door or a ramp. And that's what they'll be crossing the channel on. Bear in mind, these things go at maybe maximum 10 knots, if that. Maybe 6 knots at most for most of them. And that's on a river, which is calm, basically. It is normally, the river is normally flowing, but it's not got waves. It's not got a storm that rocks it every few days or whatever. And the channel is treacherous in the summer, let alone in autumn. Bear in mind, we're the largest summer storm in recorded history up to that point, just prior to the Normandy landings. That's why it had to be postponed 24 hours. Or 40 hours, basically, or whatever. So it's crazy to think that you would cross the channel in these barges, which could sink in anything but a light swell. Anything more than a light swell. It's absolutely bloody ridiculous. And then you add into the fact that people was, the BEF was disarmed in Dunkirk. Dunkirk was in early June. The planned invasion of Britain was in September. They could have might come earlier, but it was basically at least 3 months or so. By that point, the British Army had been mostly re-equipped with at least their small arms. There were people tend to feel like there were units in Britain withheld from going to France. Let's just say the threat of invasion was higher. For example, bear in mind in July, August, Churchill has sent sent forces from Britain to North Africa to support the fight against the Italians. But if the threat of the Germans was greater, they probably would have stayed in the UK. Let's just say that, for example. You have the bulk of the BEF, which had been rescued, basically been re-equipped with their small arms. You have the French forces that are now in Britain, where were evacuated, which is roughly about 100,000 or more. Because it wasn't just Dunkirk they evacuated. They were evacuating Calais and other Channel ports as well. They were evacuating troops. So there was roughly British Army regulars, roughly 500,000, along with other troops as well. You have forces from the Empire. You have I think there was an Australian division at the time, which was coming into the UK. There was a Canadian division in the UK as well as all forces from all the occupied countries as well. Czechoslovakia, Poland, Norway, you name it. All in Britain. As well as 2 whole armoured divisions were in the UK at the time. Then you add into that the fighting power of the Home Guard. People tend to say, just the Home Guard. It's like, well, by September, they had at least small arms, and some units had other heavy weapons. Like, you had things like the Blacker Bombard, etc., which the Home Guard were using to very good effect. Could be used to very good effect. Which was, it was a very primitive, but at the same time, very effective piece of equipment. Along with other things the Home Guard use, all these improvised weapons. That's just the Home Guard. And the Home Guard would be used to control defences more inland, giving the regular army its opportunity to defend the more key points. All this extra manpower, which is very capable. As I said again, 2 whole armour divisions, as I said before, bear in mind, the Germans would need a port to land the bulk of their armour. All the Germans had swimming tanks, only a few. And they weren't exactly the best things, and their light armour. It'd be like things like a Panzer II or a Panzer I. This isn't like a Tiger. People say, German armour just flight. It's like, it's a Panzer II. The British had anti-tank rifles which were capable of knocking those out at that point. Panzer IIs, Panzer Is, very vulnerable to anti-tank rifles and light anti-tank weapons. Let alone all the irregular types of anti-tank weapon. And then you add in mines. The south coast would have been mined to buggery, along with all the other coastal defences and inland defences built. By the end of it, the British built 28,000 pillboxes across the United Kingdom for the defence. and that's just pillboxes. All that goes with it is trenches, barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, communication trenches, minefields, you name it. And as I said, like barbed wire and that, and then you add in other devices that were to be used in case of invasion, like fire defences, i.e. using petrol, because people tend to think like Britain actually had a massive stockpile of fuel, like a huge stockpile. A large part of that was specifically fuel designated for anti-invasion purposes, like these barrels were given to like units of the Home Guard and that to use in the defense of their positions or their towns. Like we had a huge amount of excess fuel to use in defense. So if it was to use as beach defences or town defences or whatever, the British basically were the ones who properly really developed napalm and had devices and bombs and etc. to use against things to some extent, but more so later on in the war when that was properly developed and obviously used quite effectively in Vietnam, obviously. But that's one thing. But there was defences, etc., and then proposals to use chemical weapons on the beach, like mustard gas, etc., which would have been very effective against any invasion force. The British would have been prepared, the Germans would have had no idea. They're landing troops, and suddenly the bulk of their force goes down as gas casualties, and they're very vulnerable. Basically, the proposed, when sort of different war games were played out, etc., the rough estimate on the first wave for a German landing was roughly 30 to 40% casualties, which is insane. Bear in mind, like they expected more casualties on D-Day, for example, but the preparedness had prevented more loss than happened. However, with the invasion of Britain, that was probably a very accurate estimate, perhaps even more. Bear in mind, you're landing out of converted rivercraft under the sights of prepared defenders who knew you were coming. Because bear in mind, the Germans didn't know the invasion was happening until it happened. Like troops were landing, and not even like after the paratroop landed. Some didn't even know the actual naval invasion was happening until hours afterwards. The British would know if invasion was happening probably 24 hours prior, because people think, oh, the Germans could have just crossed the channel. Like, bear in mind, they have to get there first. Like, it's one thing a destroyer going at full speed on its own, crossing the channel can take a few hours, maybe even less than that, depending where it's going from. If it's going from Dover to Calais, only an hour or two. But this is river barges moving at very slow speeds, crossing an area at some points widens up when you've got to land at the further points in the west. Very vulnerable and easily detectable. They would have been spotted hours, maybe even a day before. So the bulk of the British Army would be ready to receive and prevent an invasion. Probably, guessing by the preparedness and defences, like the Germans may have broken through initial coastal defences in some areas, but I think in the bulk of it, the Germans would have been stopped on the beach. Personally, I think casualties would have been so high. Like, bear in mind, during points on the 6th of June, 1944, the Americans even considered pulling out of Omaha because casualties were so high and they didn't see it progressing any more than it had done by the early afternoon. Bear in mind, they got off the beach roughly around sort of 2 o'clock in the end of the day, roughly anyway. Like, so it was, even they thought about removing troops off there, like, let alone this, where you've got prepared defences, a determined enemy, because bear in mind, in some cases, again, going back to Normandy, because this is a good comparison, like, it's very difficult, like, bear in mind, the Turks in Gallipoli were able to keep the majority of the forces close to where they'd landed for multiple months, and that was when the British and French had like overwhelming naval superiority. Like, even then, they weren't able to get much thing, and that wasn't like massive prepared defences. Like, a couple of forts and trenches built and slit trenches, but most of the time, like, yes, the Turks suffered heavy casualties, but that was then. And they were determined because they were defending their homeland. Like, this would be the same, but on a much larger scale and much more one-sided in favour of the British and their allies. It was absolutely ridiculous. So, going off too much of a tangent here. So, I've already explained about Norway. I've explained about the ideas from OKW and OKH. Let's look at the Luftwaffe. Now, as I've already pointed out before, the Luftwaffe wasn't really that capable of taking on the Royal Navy, really, to any massive extent. They'll be able to cause casualties, of course, but nothing to the extent that will be able to prevent any ship getting in the channel. And that's all that needs to happen. The Royal Navy doesn't necessarily need to knock out or stop the invasion forthwith. Like, all they need to do is get in the channel and disrupt it enough to stop supplies coming ashore to support the invasion. So if the Germans had landed, they knocked out and got through the coastal defences and pushed up to the next stop line, which was the Winston line, the main next stop line on the south coast. There were multiple of these stop lines all over the United Kingdom for defensive defence in depth, basically. And people say, well, the Germans can knock out the pillboxes. Yeah, we've got to find them first. Do you think the pillbox would be bloody obvious in 1940? It's one thing seeing a pillbox today. You could see it. Might be a bit covered over by leaves and that, from where the trees or whatever and the bushes are growing around it. But at that point, they'd be camouflaged, deliberately camouflaged. So you wouldn't see them from the air. Like, you wouldn't see any of them from the air. It was very difficult to find out where these things were. They would look, from the air, they would look like part of the beach, part of the countryside, part of a hedge. They were deliberately disguised because obviously it's like, we don't want to get knocked out from the air. It was easy. But thing is, like, the Germans, for example, right, let's look at German air power. So, British estimates were very overestimating the power of the Luftwaffe. So, for example, the estimated numbers of bombers that the British thought the Luftwaffe had was 2,550. In actual fact, they had less than 1,000 at 988. Fighters, the British estimates were 1,550 again. Well, not again, but 1,550. Just under 1,200 actually they had fighters in total. And bear in mind, this is the total amount of Luftwaffe numbers, which were, like, not all of these were used in the attack in Britain. Bear in mind, the Germans had to cover the rest of their occupied territory, which includes Poland, Norway, etc., and other areas, including the defence of Germany itself. So all of these aircraft would not be in France attacking the Royal Air Force. Probably about half of these numbers, or maybe 3/4 at most. And they were stockpiling aircraft to attack the Soviet Union as well. So even when I tell you the actual number, even when I'm telling you the actual numbers, these aren't the numbers being used against the RAF, in general anyway. As a thing anyway. They suspected 500 dive bombers. They had just over 300. 400 coastal aircraft, they thought. Only 108. 400 other aircraft, so this is like trainers, etc., and other spotter aircraft probably, or observation aircraft. They expected 400. Only had 131. And these coastal aircraft are probably like seaplanes and other observation aircraft. The Germans only had a handful of HE-115 torpedo bombers. Only a handful in 1940. They would have some more later, but only a small amount in 1940, which were the ones primarily designed to take on shipping effectively. But even then, once you lose several, you don't have them anymore until you build any more. So that's another thing. So it really was a massive overestimate by the British, and bear in mind, literally, of the actual numbers, as I said, only probably about 2/3 were actually fighting the RAF at any point, just because of other duties they were on. And as I've already said, the Kriegsmarine was heavily outnumbered. It was a fool's errand. This whole situation is a massive fool's errand. Sorry if the video is very much jumping about a bit. I'm just trying to cover different bases, etc. And as I said, the attack on shipping would be negligible, really negligible. Like, for example, during the Battle of Britain, for example, between July the 10th and the 31st, the RAF lost 91 aircraft. During the same period, the Luftwaffe lost 185. Now, through the whole of the Battle of Britain, the RAF lost 1,023 aircraft of all types. The Germans lost about over 800 more aircraft during the whole of the Battle of Britain. That is a lot of aircraft. And that is aircraft that was very much needed for the invasion of Russia a year later, which they didn't have. And bear in mind, of those 1,888 aircraft lost, almost all of the crews for those aircraft would have been lost to the war effort, either if they were killed when they were shot down, or if they bailed out, because they'd been bailing out over Britain. Or over the sea, close to the British coast, well, if they survived the jumping out of the aircraft in parachute, probably would have been picked up by British Coastal Command. So all of those little guys were lost to the war effort. A large proportion of the German prisoners in the early part of World War II in Britain were Luftwaffe because of that. So it's just one of those things, and people sort of worked with the German bombing campaign targeting British industry, like during the whole of the Battle of Britain. Britain suffered only 17 severe bomb hits. Obviously, they hit multiple times, but nothing severe enough to knock it out. Probably was repaired in about a week or so, or even less than that. But severe bomb hits, only 17 throughout the whole of the Battle of Britain. So that was the armament manufacturing, electrical manufacturing, gas, etc., water industry, oil industry, food production, and ports and docks. 17 severe bomb hits over the entirety of the Battle of Britain in all targets. It's ridiculous. It is ridiculous. And it it just pales in comparison to what happened later in the war with the Allied bombing campaign in Germany. Yes, it still wasn't as effective as they wanted it to be, but it was way more effective than the German campaign. I'll say that. And the ordnance, they would need to take on British ships as well, as I said. Like the bombs they had in 1940 for dive bombers specifically weren't powerful enough to penetrate battleship deck armor as a standard at that point in the war. So it was a bit ridiculous, them trying to take on the Royal Navy in any case. And bear in mind, for the German Kriegsmarine to be safe out of range of British capital ship naval gunnery, they would have to lay a minefield so many miles deep that they would be laying that minefield for weeks. Bear in mind, the Royal Navy had plenty of minesweepers just to sweep through it. And probably would immediately sweep mines after the Germans had laid them. It would have been pathetic. So the capital ships wouldn't even have to enter the channel, probably. They would just have to just shoot them at them throughout. And I've had comments and replies on comment sections of other videos which I've commented on. About what about the German coastal artillery? What of it? It was but the German coastal artillery was wildly ineffective at targeting British coastal installations in the first place, i.e. there was a battle between British coastal guns and German coastal guns between themselves, and nothing was really hit by the British either as well. And bear in mind that was a stationary target. The Royal Navy could throw one capital ship, for example, against that one gun or whatever many guns it be, and completely wreck it, because they would know where it was, because they'd known where it was for ages. It's absolutely all the Royal Navy will be subject to being attacked by that, maybe, but the Royal Navy can reply in kind with more firepower and more heavier firepower than being used against it. One 10-inch gun against 8 on a British capital ship of 15-inch caliber. It's a bit of a one-sided contest, really. And again, the Royal Navy can just throw a bunch of destroyers into the channel, and all they have to do is just knock out a few transport ships, and then the invasion fails. Because it's one thing landing a force, it's another thing supplying that force with ammunition, food, medical supplies, etc., fuel. And again, they need to take a port to get that armour, which is key to German blitzkrieg tactics. Or to German tactics at that point in the war. Blitzkrieg is a bit of a contested use of the phrase really now, but some people don't know that. But it's very one-sided completely, because they need to take a port. Most ports would have been sabotaged by the British before withdrawal. Actually, no, they would have been sabotaged by the British before withdrawal, which means the Germans would have had to spend time bringing those up to take shipping, which meant that would give time for the War Navy to come down and absolutely wreck the Kriegsmarine, which it would have done easily. Absolutely bloody easily. Like, the Kriegsmarine was not built for it. Like, for example, destroyer and destroyer actions, generally the British came out on top with the Germans as a general. It's not always the case, but it generally was quite one-sided. Norway shows that. And then adding capital ships, German destroyers were very and then you look at the Italians, for example. People say, the Italians could help with the invasion, maybe, but then they've got to get out. The Italians then have to get out of the Mediterranean. How do you think they're going to do that? There was a force in Alexandria. There was a force in Malta. There was a force in Gibraltar. How do you think the Italians would get past Gibraltar with the amount of coastal guns there? People say, thing is, Gibraltar had been purpose-built to defend against naval action for centuries. And it was very obvious, and the straits are a lot more narrow at Gibraltar than they are between Calais and Dover. They're a lot more narrow, ridiculously more narrow. And again, there would be a force at Gibraltar defending, as well as Malta. And the Italians would not. It would be bloody obvious if the Italians attempted to break out into the Atlantic. They never tried throughout the whole of the war because it was suicide for the entirety of the Reggio Marina. I can never remember the actual saying, but the Italian Navy. Maybe they might be able to get one or two destroyers out, but then again, that's just what's one or two destroyers against the entirety of the Royal Navy. It's utterly preposterous and utterly mind-bogglingly moronic to attempt that. It's there's a lot of things I've put down. Really, there really is a lot of things I've put down. Like the in general, what if the Germans had landed then? What if they managed to get ashore? They managed to keep the Royal Navy away for a bit longer than sort of would be reality. Would the Germans win? No, they wouldn't, because again, the defences in the United Kingdom are massive. Let alone the Home Guard and the regular forces and all this sort of stuff. But we've also got the auxiliary units, which have been set up in 1940 to basically be the British answer, or Britain's answer to the resistance movements like you had on the continent, but who were very well armed, who were armed directly from the government, who were basically hit squads. There were about 3,000 members of the auxiliaries, roughly 3,000 members, stationed in hideouts all over the United Kingdom, and their thing was to take out individual targets in the way of more physical targets, fuel dumps, etc., assassinations of either German personnel or sympathisers. Then the first task was actually to kill the local who was around, who probably knew about the hideout, was to get rid of them first, which is quite morbid, really, but that was really what the case was really at the time. And it's absolutely crazy, this whole sense of, even if the Germans had landed, it would have been ridiculous. It would have just been a suicide mission for multiple divisions of the German cream of the crop, i.e. troops they would have never had back for several more years, and they would not had for the invasion of Russia. It would have been an absolute disaster. It would have just led to the deaths of tens of thousands of German troops. it would have been absolutely disastrous. And bear in mind, each village in southern England, and mostly around the UK, but especially in southern England, where the invasion was most probably going to happen, were basically turned into small fortresses. Each town had its own home guard unit, if it was like 50 men strong, or even a few blokes. It was absolutely immense. And the Germans had to take each individual town before, and the British had removed all road signs. So the Germans wouldn't know where the hell they were. The Germans would be landing and thinking, like, okay, going in ad, where's this place? We didn't know where we are. Absolutely no idea. The paratroopers would have been absolutely massacred, in my personal view, because majority of German airborne operations during the war were conducted during the day, and mass drops, and like we saw in Crete, it would have been absolutely disastrous because we knew they were coming. It was bloody obvious. They were attempting to land on airfields, again, which would be defended, and a lot of airfields had defences on the outside pointing inwards, so if you had landings on the airfield or wherever it be, that would be a killing ground. A very good example of this still remaining is in Wales. The pillboxes and all the defences are pointing inwards onto the airfield because they knew that if the Germans tried to capture this with the airborne, they would try to land on the airfield because then they could land other aircraft to support, like they did on Crete. And even in Crete, even when the defences weren't as strong, like actual like physical like pillboxes etc., weren't as strong like that in the UK, the Fallschirmjäger suffered huge casualties, and they were never used in that way again, properly anyway, in a mass attack. And they were roughly planning to use 3,000 airborne troops, 3,000 on the invasion of Britain. How many transport aircraft would that be? Immense amount of transport aircraft. Probably have to be multiple drops over several days. And again, they'd be prepared. If they were landing in open fields, the British had plans, especially if they had that much warning, which they would do, at least 24 hours, to put defences and obstacles everywhere, over every single field in southern England, where the Fallschirmjäger would land, because they would have to land further enough inland to support, but also close enough to the beaches to support the landings themselves. But they would probably land on airfields and open fields close enough to airfields and strategic points, which the British knew where they would be. So that's why they were planting the defences. And these stop lines went all inland. So if the Germans, the paratroopers landed, they would probably be pinned between two stop lines, two defensive lines, which then would easily sort of like, look at what happened to the British at Arnhem in 1944, for example. Even with massive air support and the weaponry they had at the time to take on armour, for example, even they struggled to, and obviously they struggled massively and had to eventually be evacuated from Oosterbeek on the 9th day. That was just there, let alone dropping. You're having to wait on troops coming ashore without armour support, or barely any, with hit and miss air cover. You don't know where the defences are that you need to take out. You know where the strategic points are in regards to industry or bridges, etc., but you don't know where the actual defences are, to say the least. You might know where a few are, but not the in-depth. You don't know the actual force probably you'll be fighting in the area, because all your intelligent agents have all been either captured or turned by this point. So you don't have really any good information on the area, apart from a guidebook from the 30s showing you all the local hotspots to go to in the countryside or wherever it may be. It's absolutely bloody ludicrous, and it frustrates me when these things get overlooked. Like there was a documentary. Oh God, when was it? Oh God, at least 15 years ago or more. It was called, I think it was called Hitler's Britain. It was interesting, but it was also almost like this doom and gloom thing of Britain never had a chance and all this sort of stuff. And and then there was another one, actually, about a year ago. It was about defences, like in Britain or whatever, and all this sort of stuff. They covered the stop lines and the coastal defences and the defences of Britain. And they sort of, they were built really rushed, they weren't that good, and German tank rounds go straight through it. What tanks do you think the Germans are landing? Fucking, sorry to swear, but bloody like Tiger 2s, like King Tigers. Like the majority of the armour that the Germans would be able to land effectively and quickly, enough anyway, would be Panzer 1s and Panzer 2s. The largest of the calibre, sorry, there's a fly, the largest of the calibre would be 20mm, which, again, wouldn't do much to a pillbox, because it would be concrete and brick. It was brick and then covered in concrete. Some of them were more brick built just as standard, but they were still several, like at least about a foot thick, roughly, in certain places. Like, they were designed to take rounds from tank rounds, like 50mm plus. Like, the Germans wouldn't be able to land them vehicles specifically until they captured ports. And until they captured ports, that tank support would not be forthcoming. So it's utterly ridiculous. Everything would have to go without a hitch, ridiculously. Like, they would have to capture the ports intact. They would have to be landing without much resistance. The weather had to be benign. Luftwaffe had to be very effective against coastal defences, once pointed out by the ground troops. It would have to go so without a hitch to succeed. Any little thing going wrong would completely make it ridiculous. And it was ridiculous. Let's see what else I've got. Like, it's like one prediction made by the first Sea Lord, Sir Dudley Pound, was that the Royal Navy wouldn't be able to intervene in stopping the invasion, or halting or preventing the Germans from landing in the first place. That's something I've actually heard, from this gentleman, gentleman who was on this podcast, and some people in the comments who clearly were trying to peddle his book as well. Clearly had a hard on for his things, just because they've got this weird fantasy of this weird saviour complex of the United States coming to our aid like a knight on a horse, which I've seen quite a few times actually. It's quite it's very off-putting actually. It's very delusional and very, very short-sighted. It's like, oh well, even your own navy was very adamant that they wouldn't be able to stop an invasion. Yeah, from initially happening in the first place, because they wouldn't be able to make it down the channel in time. Because again, the navy was coming from Scapa. The bulk of the navy and the home fleet was coming from Scapa Flow. But even then, even the Germans had landed, once one or two ships from the Royal Navy are in the channel, that's disruption in itself. All they've got to do is sink a couple of transports, and literally it's just prevent anything from crossing, or most things from crossing for a day or two. And then the German position in Britain would be untenable, absolutely untenable. It's utterly ridiculous, the whole of the situation. And as I said, like, with the defences in Britain, you've got pillboxes, defence lines, and everything else stopping. And the idea is that you can't stop an invasion in that sort of sense. You can't prevent them from landing. Well, you can try, and it has been done before, really, but it's very difficult to prevent the actual guys landing in the first place. But the main idea behind the stop lines and defences was to cause delay for more troops to come up. And it would have been absolutely disastrous for the Germans. Absolutely disastrous. It's crazy, and that's sort of my sort of ending to it. Sorry to go on for quite a while. Hopefully this is still recording and not thinking that otherwise I've just rambled to a non-doing phone for the past hour or however long this has been, because it's been a while now. Excuse me. Operation Sealion was a fool's errand, and the delusions of grandeur that God, my nose really itches for some reason. And the delusions of grandeur from certain people in German high command were just utterly ridiculous. The whole situation. It's not viable. It's utterly preposterous in my sort of end of the day. But yeah. Again, sorry if I went on so many different tangents. In my head, I was trying to think about structuring this into sort of a streamline kind of thing. But that's at least, but whatever it is. But hopefully this has been interesting. If you are still hanging around now and not got so irritated with me going off in different directions. But I will try to do maybe a later video talking about what if the Germans had landed kind of thing. Like, I'll try and do that with but like with Google Maps or something, actually, that'd be quite interesting to do, to show that sort of bit. I'd also use something called, actually a great website I'll put in the description is called EDOB. It basically shows all of the defences that are still there and were there during the war. And it is quite fascinating. There are like a lot. And that mostly shows the sort of the more purpose-built, like, big defences, like pillboxes, anti-tank ditches, etc. And also shows where some barbed wire was in that as well. But also, the amount of earthworks that went into the defence was insane. As I said all this before, slit trenches, etc., like, which will be manned day and night by members of the Home Guard, for example, or whoever. And it's just the overwhelming disadvantage that the Germans had at this point in an attempt of invasion of the United Kingdom is ridiculous. And any other thought of, oh, what if the Germans did this? Well, no, it's ridiculous and it's completely unintelligible in my view. All essences are just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And in my personal view, as pointed out by some other people, which in the videos I will put in the description, Sealion was a completely and ridiculously bad idea. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you later. Bye guys.